It's that time on the program when we turn our entire focus on the worsening spate of insecurity in Nigeria, and our guest for that conversation is Dr. Kabir Adamu, the Managing Director of Beacon Consulting Limited, a security and policy analyst. Good morning and welcome to the morning show. Dr. Kabir, now the recent terrorist attacks in Plateau State showcased a disturbing level of ferocity. A recent report also mentioned villagers in Ondo State fleeing their homes due to the menace of marauding terrorist headsmen. Now, looking at this incident in Ondo State as a part of a broader security crisis, as evidenced by the different attacks we've been seeing, how interconnected are these incidents across states, and what role does it play in the broader national security landscape? And given this evolving nature of security threats, what changes or adaptations do you believe are necessary in Nigeria's security architecture to effectively address these challenges highlighted in your report, of course, in your database?
Good morning and Happy New Year. I'm delighted to be here with you. Unfortunately, the subject of our discussion is not a subject that makes one happy. You've asked me so many questions. I'll try to break them down. Starting with what is the common threat that we're seeing in the attacks across the different locations of the country. Now, that common threat is the activities of what I have called non-state armed groups. These are groups that are not constitutionally recognized, who have taken up arms, who are, in essence, challenging the supremacy of the use of force by the state. In the northwest, they are called bandits, as it were. In north central and to an extent northeast, you also find them. But then if more in the traditional northeastern states of Adamawa, Borno, and Yobe, you can sometimes call them terrorist groups. A good example is the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah Lil-Dawati wal-Jihad and the Islamic State in West Africa province. Likewise, if you go to the southeast, they are the secessionist group. They are also non-state actors who have armed themselves and are perpetrating violence in different forms. In the Niger Delta, they are militants and other criminal groups that have also taken up arms and are either engaging in militancy or oil theft or other criminal activities. They are also challenging the supremacy of the use of force by the state. So in essence, that's the common threat across all the regions. With regard to what our database is saying, now several things. As an example, we have been able to compare in terms of the number of incidents that have occurred this year when you compare it with that of 2022. And interestingly, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, in the case of fatalities, we've seen a decline of about 27% from the around 10,000 that was recorded last year to around 8,000 that is recorded this year. And that's looking at just the face value. In other words, the general value of the fatalities without looking at some nominal factors, which I will discuss shortly. In the case of kidnap for ransom, what we have seen from the around 6,000 that was recorded last year, we've seen a reduction in 2023 to roughly around 3,900, which is a reduction of about 27%. So also a reduction. Again, that's for the general overview. But then if you look at some nominal values, it would be a little bit difficult to say this is possibility of happiness or progress. Now, what are those values that I'm talking about? From around September, we saw an increase, as it were, in the number of incidents to around 98%. We were recording around 700 deaths in a month, but by September, it peaked to over 1,000. And that is what sustained up until the end of the year in December, where that figure of 1,000 continued. The same thing for abduction. We saw an increase of almost about 70-something% in the case of abduction from month to month. So clearly, there is a resurgence of violence across the country. But like I said, if you are comparing, just on the face value for 2022 and 2023, there has been a reduction. I know you asked me a question around what can be done to reduce all of this, but I'm hoping that in the course of our conversation, we can look at that.
Thank you, sir. So I want to follow up on something you said, because you've spoken about both bandits and terrorists. You said, in the northeast, or north central, depending on what they are, different words, these words are used interchangeably. But I want us to speak about this very specifically, because people often use the term herdsmen when we talk about these different organizations or these different armed groups. When it comes to terrorists, are we seeing an increase in Islamic jihadists, for example, who are terrorizing for ideological aims? Or are we seeing an increase in banditry, people who are terrorizing for financial reasons, who are kidnapping or land grabbing or castle rustling? I think the security situation in this country is very complex. I'd like for you to speak more to the difference between banditry or herdsmen and terrorists specifically.
All right, so we have a Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act that was amended in 2022, and it's very clear. It defines who is a terrorist in Nigeria. Under that act, there is a sanctions list that is supposed to be maintained by the Attorney General of the Federation. He also has a committee that he heads, and that committee has membership from different government departments. Now, the idea is if someone is involved in terrorism, is suspected to be a terrorist, his or her name is submitted to that committee, as it were. That committee would use the judicial processes to determine if that individual or that person, that company, has committed any offense that is categorized as terrorism under that act, and then he or she is added to that sanctions list. Unfortunately, and this is from my experience and operation as well as in interaction with the government security departments, we do not see enough of the implementation of that TPPA Act. In other words, the military would, almost on a weekly basis, issue statements, and in that statement, they would claim to have killed several terrorists. But then I go back to that sanctions list to check if the names of those persons that they claim to have killed are in that sanctions list, and they're not there. So I start asking myself, what gives the military the authority, as an example, to call an individual or a group terrorist when that TPP Act is very clear about who should be categorized as terrorist? So that's number one, our inability to comply with the provisions of that Terrorism Prevention and Prohibition Act. The challenge with that is that when that act was envisaged, the idea is that it would help in galvanizing the Nigerian population and carry everybody along in terms of the use of language as well as the terminologies that would determine who or what a terrorist is. And because we are not implementing that act fully, unfortunately, Nigerians are divided. And that brings me to the second part of your question, the difference between terrorists and bandits, as it were. In the last government, they attempted to as it were, include two bandit groups into this TPP Act, and that is what they call Yembindiga and I think Yembanga. Now, for any Hausa-speaking person, he knows that that is a generic term. Yembindiga means gunmen, as it were. So it's a bit vague. When you say gunmen, as far as I know, and I'm a practitioner with almost about 27 years experience in Nigerian security, I don't know that there is any group called Yembindiga. There are several groups called Yembanga. Yembanga is a Hausa word meaning vigilantes. There is no community, I think, in Nigeria that does not have a vigilante. So when that law was passed under the immediate past Attorney General, we asked the question, why is it so vague? Why not be specific to say this is the particular Yembindiga gunmen that you are including as that in that Terrorism Prevention Act, or this is the particular Yembanga that you are including? So that's number two. There is no, from the point of view of our law, that there is no clarity as regards whether these bandits have been included within the Terrorism Prevention Act. Operationally, what that inclusion of Yembanga and Yembindiga did to the government is to allow the use of certain assets that the military has against these bandits. So from an operational point of view, it was good. But from a legal point of view, unfortunately, it wasn't so good. From the point of view of the implementation of our counter-terrorism act that we have, unfortunately, it did not really help because, like I said, it's extremely vague. We know of some bandit commanders who have committed terrorist act. If you pick the TPPA, all their actions are terrorist acts. As an example, Dogo Gide, some of his actions when he abducts individuals and then call on the government to release his members, or does kill students and all of that. All of these are acts that can be categorized clearly as terrorist acts. But it will surprise you that his name is not on that sanctions list that I referred to earlier on. So several other bandit commanders, their names are not on that list. So from the point of view of legal clarification of the difference between bandits and the terrorist groups that we know, the law recognizes groups like the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah lil Dawat wal Jihad as terrorist groups. It recognizes the Islamic State in West Africa province as terrorist groups. And like I said, there was an attempt to include what was called Mbindiga and Yembanga. But from a practical point of view, unfortunately, the law has not been very clear in making that distinction between the terrorist groups and the bandit groups that operate in Nigeria.
All right, Dr. Adamu, I like the fact that you were clear about the fact that there's a resurgence of violence and terror attacks across the country. But I'm interested in what your recommendations will be, what you will have the current government, the administration do, and not just to stop the spate of violence, but to go after those who are financing terror. As you recall, one song that the former, the immediate past Minister for Information, Alhaji Lai Mohammed, sang throughout the 8 years of the administration was the fact that they knew those who were behind terror. And you also alluded to the fact that, there's a list going around. America in 2021, Dubai, UAE government in 2022, who were clear about those that they knew that were doing something. And they even made some lists available to the Nigerian government. But I doubt if we saw any concrete action taken by the past administration to deal with those who are behind terror and who are financing it. So clearly, what will you like the administration of Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu to do in clear terms to deal with this resurgence?
Thank you, Steve. One of the things that the Bola Ahmed Tinubu administration did in November is to institutionalize Executive Order 13 into the administration. In other words, a performance management system is now in place. And of course, tied to that performance management system is the consequence management component. In other words, from performance management, you'll be able to know which minister is performing and who is not performing. And then, of course, there will be consequences. We hope that there will be consequences. And I'm quite delighted that the individual that has been given that responsibility to manage that system, Hajia Hadiza Bala, is someone that we know, at least based on how she ran the Ports Authority, is quite effective and efficient in her management style. So we're hoping that we'll also see that she's going to head the Central Delivery Coordination Unit. Now, how does this affect the security sector? The administration had, if you had looked at the Renewed Hope agenda, there are a couple of things that the administration mentioned in that Renewed Hope agenda, which as a security practitioner and expert, I can say those things are quite good. As an example, when it says it's going to renew the military doctrine and philosophy, that's quite good. We need that. We need a security sector reform, including for the military. We also need additional manpower across all the sectors of the spheres of security in the country. We also need improved equipment, the welfare of the military. the winning and hearts and minds of the people, a special, unit within the military to address banditry, as it were, and to address terrorism. All of these are contained in the Renewed Hope agenda. They're very good and they are commendable. Improved border management, name them, digitization of our identity, and which informed the move of NIMSI to the Ministry of Interior. So you now have a harmonized unit for that. All of these are commendable, but they are only on paper. So if this performance management system that the administration has embraced is extended to the security sector, what I hope to see is the use of metrics, as an example. At the beginning of this conversation, I was able to tell you in clear terms that in 2022, we lost this number of persons, near 10,000. In 2023, we lost almost about 9,000 persons. So clearly, like I said, there is a reduction, but it is not yet Uhuru. Any country that loses up to 9,000 persons should not be happy about it. I would want to see a situation where that number is reduced to 1,000. So how would metric help us? It will help us in the performance management system, where key performance indicators will be developed by Hajia Hadiza's unit, and then they will engage the security sector periodically to ask them in clear terms. Abduction is at this stage when you are appointed as Inspector General of Police. You've submitted a budget. You've asked for ABC within that budget. It's been given to you. How come abduction is still at this level? What are you going to do to reduce it to, let's say, 100 or 1,000, as the case may be, depending on what baseline was agreed in the bilateral engagement between the two sides? So that's the kind of approach. And then, of course, the consequence management component would be where reasonable time, and because security is so important to us, that reasonable time shouldn't be more than 6 months, frankly. If at the end of 6 months we don't see an improvement, that person should be changed. So in simple terms, that's my recommendation. Beyond all the other operational issues that I would probably want to talk about in terms of collaboration, coordination, and cooperation, there are 29 MDAs that are involved in security in Nigeria. If those 29 MDAs are working together, they embrace these 3 C's that I've mentioned: cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. Steve, we're not going to sit about and complain about security. Plateau happened. It started around the 22nd. Today, on the 7th of December, I'm not aware that any of these 29 that I've mentioned has briefed us as a country to say these are the people that were behind that attack. These are the people that have been arrested. This is what we intend to do to prevent a reoccurrence. We can't manage security like that. There needs to be more accountability. There needs to be more engagement with the people. The space has now been left so open that a lot of conspiracy theories have emerged. You just need to go into X or any of the social media platforms and you'll be shocked at the kind of conspiracy theories that are going around. And sadly, it's not going to help improve the security. It's rather more, dividing the community. And then sadly, those that are behind the attack have been emboldened because we've not arrested them, we've not prosecuted them. They're seeing this division that is creeping up, and they would, use that as a vulnerability, unfortunately, and I don't want to be a harbinger of bad news, to carry out further attacks in the future, sadly.
All right, Dr. Kabir, thank you for, helping us try to understand, the difference between bandits and, terrorists, even though we have not gotten a concrete answer to that particular question. But there's also been a debate as to the root cause of the violence or the terror in the north, especially in Plateau State, which, have been considered as one of the most peaceful states in Nigeria. Some have attributed it to, land grabbing, religious or ethnic genocide. Last week, the chairman of the Northern Governors Forum and Gombe State Governor, Inwa Yahaya, attributed this conflict to issues like farmer herders clashes and the clamor for indigenes versus settlers. He called all stakeholders to, have a roundtable and, kind of tell each other the truth and take deliberate steps towards loving each other. He made mention of the fact that any society or country that doesn't welcome visitors will not progress. I'd like your assessment with your detailed data as to the root cause of this crisis or terrorism as we know it as.
Yeah, so Oji, it's very clear that one of the most obvious root causes that Governor Inua Yahaya did not speak about is the ineffectiveness of our criminal justice system to arrest and punish offenders. I just mentioned a few minutes ago that it's now, I think, about from 22nd to the 7th of January. That's almost about 2 weeks. And as far as I know, apart from the 8 persons that were quote unquote arrested, we've not been told what kind of evidences were gathered before they were arrested. I've heard from locals within Plateau State, they are extremely doubtful about the authenticity of the fact that those persons arrested were the suspects. So that for me is number one, the inability of the criminal justice system to identify, and then to arrest offenders. As far back as probably 1994, if I can remember, under the military era, there have been several both administrative and judicial commissions of inquiry that have been set up to look into the crisis in Plateau State. You can call it conflict, you can call it crisis. As far as I know, none of the reports of those commissions of inquiry have ever been implemented. I want to repeat that. None of those commissions of inquiry, whether administrative or judiciary, has been implemented. So clearly, there is a political unwillingness to address the challenge in the Plateau State. And tied to that is the inability of the law enforcement agencies to carry out their work. Associated with that is the fact that we have a military operation that was set up on the Plateau in 2010. Now, 14 years after that military operation, after billions of naira, probably up to 1 trillion naira or more, has not achieved its purpose. And nobody in government is calling the founders of that operation, the implementers of that operation, to say, look, this was meant to be a stopgap operation. It's been ongoing for 13 years. How come it's not meeting its objective? Do we need to allow it to continue, or should we scrap it and then come up with something more effective? Because clearly, if it's not effective, then we should make it either effective or we should completely dismantle it. I'm talking of Operation Safe Haven here. It was meant to be a stopgap operation to address the root causes, as it were, especially the law enforcement component of it. Don't forget that there are the traditional security agencies too on the Plateau. The police is there, the SSS is there, name them. All the other about 19 or thereabout are also domiciled on the Plateau. How come none of them is able to stop this? And we're keeping quiet. Every year there's a budgetary provision for them. And by this, I'm not just referring to the federal government. I'm also talking about the state government, and I'm also talking about the legislative arm of government. All of these MDAs that I talked about, they're in the executive arm. If they failed, just like we agreed that they failed, how come the legislative arm of government is not looking into the reasons why they failed and then taking legislative measures to ensure that there is some form of accountability within them? So sadly, this is the reality that we've working to in Nigeria. We have institutions that unfortunately are not effective, and for some reasons we do not take action to either penalize those that are heading those units or to ensure that they become effective through the mechanism that I talked about earlier on, the performance management mechanism. So going forward, I'm hoping that is what will change. But I don't want us to kid ourselves about the fact that we don't know the reasons for the conflict in Plateau State. All of those committees of either administrative or judicial one have given reasons. I've spoken about the criminal justice system, the settler-indigene dichotomy is there. The possibility that the minerals in the state, or resources, let me just generalize it as resources, the mineral, the land, name them, could also be a trigger of that. But also more importantly is the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. OG, till today, as a country, we've not effectively institutionalized the platform for mopping up small arms and light weapons. The mass casualty that we saw in Plateau State would not have been possible if there were no small arms and light weapons in the hands of the perpetrators. We're still battling between the center that we have in the Office of the National Security Advisor and then this other commission that is operating illegally because it does not even have a presidential assent, yet it's operating in the country. So I think the National Assembly, the 10th National Assembly, needs to really look at that issue, ensure we have a functional commission for mopping up small arms and light weapons. And then, of course, the drug issue that is also prevalent, issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion in governance within the state. All of these are the drivers of the conflict. Of course, the role of the social media, and I think that's your expertise. The social media has not really helped the situation, and I blame the government as it were. The space was left almost, without any information, and so the social media took over the space, and what you have now is a lot of conspiracy theories, and it's not helping the situation. Lastly, is the role of, or absence rather, of restorative justice. Because the issue has been ongoing to as far back as the most recent one is the early 90s, but I'm told that it dates back to even before we got our independence. Now, for you to address it, you need to have restorative justice, the type of justice that addresses grievances, that brings the communities that are divided together, and then peace-building components are also implemented so that those persons who feel aggrieved are able to hug each other and at the end of the day, shake hands, and then decide to live together. If once we do not have restorative justice, those communities cannot do that.
Dr. Kabir Adamu, we would like to thank you very much for enlightening us on the program this morning. Thank you very much indeed. We'll continue to follow your reports and data on the insecurity in Nigeria.